Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. 1 year after the Hamas attacks, the Israel-Gaza conflict remains among the most intractable and violent situations in the world. Today, an episode from the archives about peacebuilding to help solve violent conflicts and rebuild societies through non-violent means. Dr. Josh Sharfstein talks with Michael Shipler, Vice President of Search for Common Ground, an international peacebuilding non-governmental organization. Let's listen.
Michael Shipler, thank you so much for joining me on Public Health on Call to talk about peacebuilding. And this is a field that you've worked in for a long time, and it would be great if you could explain that to our listeners.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here, Josh. Peacebuilding is indeed a field. There are tens of thousands of people around the world who have dedicated their lives to seeking to end violence, to create societies that are healthy and just, where differences is handled without using coercive adversarial means, without using violence, where people are able to stitch relationships together from across dividing lines and envision a society where violence isn't at the heart of what's happening around them, but rather there are channels and pathways to solve conflicts using nonviolent means.
And where can you find peace builders? Are they at a particular type of agency? Are they in a particular type of industry? Who's involved?
We talk about it in two different ways. On one hand, there are peace builders who are professionals or practitioners of a sector, people who are experts in actually seeking to do what I was talking about earlier, to actually forge collaborative relationships and envision new possibilities for their society. And those people exist, all different kinds of spaces. They exist in government, they exist in civil society organizations, they exist in pretty much every level of society. And people who are doing that kind of work. There are people like me who work for an NGO, like Search for Common Ground. We're a collection of about 1,000 people worldwide who define ourselves as peace builders working in conflict-divided societies. The other way we talk about it is that everybody needs to be a peace builder, actually. The effort to transform a society from one that has violence and rife division to one where decisions are made positively, where there's collaboration, societies that work for everybody, well, everybody needs to be involved. Every institution needs to play a role, whether it's private sector or schools or public health institutions. Absolutely everybody has a critical role in building peace.
So when we look around the world at areas with tremendous amounts of strife, violence, even atrocities, how do you look at that through a peace builder's eyes? In other words, what are you looking to imagine a better future?
We start with a couple of things. Firstly, the work that we do is, for peace builders is very people-centered. So we start by asking the question of what's happening to people and what role are people playing in the conflicts that are going on in their society. And secondly, we look at what are the key root causes of those conflicts. Why, in other words, why is there polarization in that society? Why is there violence? What's driving it? Is it inequities? Is it economic disparities? Is it a lack of open decision-making processes and illegitimate institutions? Do people feel powerless and are looking for ways to express their power? We ask those questions and we dive in. And then from there, we start to really forge solutions. And we've come to learn over 40 years of working in this, that there are, we talk about them, maybe this is a little funny to talk about on a public health podcast, but we talk about the 5 vital signs of a healthy and just society in our work. So one is, of course, physical violence. How much level of physical violence is happening in a society? The second is about people's personal sense of power. We talk about it as personal agency. How much influence do people feel that they have over the environment around them? A third is institutional legitimacy, which is really how much do people trust the institutions that are meant to serve them, and how much of those institutions actually really seek to involve and engage people in their decision-making. And a fourth vital sign is around polarization, which is another way of kind of talking about is how much do people trust each other across dividing lines? How much humanization and dehumanization exists across dividing lines? And a fifth is about resourcing. And this is a really important one, and I think one that's at top of our minds these days. How much resources does a society put into building peace, into building relationships and collaborative relationships versus building machinery for using violence?
Those 5 vital signs sound like very good ones to kind of assess the state of play in a particular place. And then where do you go from there?
Our organization is a peacebuilding organization. We're an international nonprofit, an international NGO. We staff out our teams with people who come from across dividing lines. Every one of our programs, we have offices in 30 countries, some of the most starkly divided societies in the world. Office in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Lebanon. We're working in Sudan, South Sudan, etc. Every single place we work, we start essentially by really rooting. And we have people who come together from across the critical divides that are dividing the society and driving that conflict to work together collaboratively. So we start with that diversity. That's at the very heart of any effort to build peace, is that ability to actually work together in a space. And we then look at what are the different opportunities and ways that we can identify people who have a significant influence over the conflicts they're working in and find ways to bring them together across those dividing lines to collaborate around their shared interests. So it might be about bringing landholders together with people who are landless, or refugees together with people in host communities, or really people across dividing lines like ethnic divides, whatever it may be, and really look at what is the common ground that they have. What are the ways that they could actually work collaboratively around those shared interests? And how can we actually enable that to be something that's really fundamental?
Am I understanding correctly that you might start with people who themselves may not be the leaders of their particular group, but then they get together, find some common ground, and then the goal is to kind of work your way up to people who have more power and can potentially help to resolve the situation?
Yeah. So what we've come to learn as a field, that in order for any kind of conflict to end, the people need to be involved at every level. So, I often like to say that wars are decided on by people sitting in a conference room somewhere, but they're fought in communities. And peace processes or peace agreements are decided on also by somebody sitting in a conference room, usually at some fancy hotel. But they're actually implemented by people in communities. And so we've come to understand that actually just getting elites together to come to some kind of power sharing agreement is wholly insufficient. It doesn't lead to enduring solutions. It certainly doesn't lead to enduring solutions to conflicts that serve people's needs and interests. But working just with people in communities, bringing them together when elites, people who hold a lot of power, aren't committed to that piece, that also doesn't work. It's easily swept away as political forces take hold.
Would there be an example of a successful peace building process that you could share?
Sure. There have been many examples of successful peace building processes in the world. It doesn't feel that way these days as the news bombards us with wave after wave of violence. I'll give you 2. Liberia just this week had an election, and the incumbent, President George Weah, lost and accepted the loss. He announced that he was going to leave office, really leading to what is going to be a peaceful transition of power. Now, Liberia had one of the most vicious, difficult civil wars of the 20th century, one which took the lives of many tens of thousands of people and absolutely racked the society. There was a peace agreement that was signed, maybe I don't remember the year, in the mid-2005, 2006, which lay out a roadmap to ending the violent conflict there, restoring democracy and establishing a democratic path. And that has been one that has held. There were a huge number of people involved, a very vibrant civil society. Search for Common Ground, where I worked, ran a radio studio which broadcast all different kinds of programming focused on enabling and equipping people to be involved in the conflict, there was a demobilization of soldiers who returned home, a reconciliation process, a justice process. And that really was one that was very successful.
And there was another, you said you give me two.
Sure, I can give you a second one. I think Nepal is another where there was a civil war between 1996 and 2006, which ended with a peace agreement that was signed between the Communist Party Nepal Maoists and the government, which lay out a 10-year roadmap, a new constitution, which transformed the whole structure of power of society. That was one that was pretty exceptional because there was a really big groundswell of participation from the public in the peace process, which involved many, many people. Young people in particular played a really critical role in that peace process, bringing that war to an end.
I kind of feel like I just want you to tell me these stories all day because it's nice to hear them these days. But I want to ask you this question. What are the conditions for a successful resolution to a peace building effort?
I mean, I really love that question. I think we often are looked to public health, as a model for us. And we say, like, what are the core elements and conditions, in a society that need to be in place for a health system to take place? And so we often talk about how an agreement between political leaders and even a groundswell of popular support for a peace process tend to be actually insufficient to really sustain peace. Those are there. You need to have political will. You need to have popular backing for peace. You need to have people mobilized and willing to be courageous and cross dividing lines and work collaboratively to find, enduring solutions. Those need to be there. But we really don't find that they succeed unless there are three key things. The first is that there need to be norms that reinforce the kind of core behavior choices that people make around peace. Norms that drive people, say, away from hyper-polarized political ideas or hyper-polarized, racist ideological ideas. Norms that actually drive people toward each other. There need to be institutional structures that really enable enduring systems of peace. That might be, justice systems that serve people equally, or mechanisms for equitable decision-making around resources of the society, whatever it might be. The third is resources. There need to be actually an investment, a flood of resources from private sector, government, all who really control marketplaces, into the core structures of peace. It's only when those three things happen that you actually start to have an interweaving and interdependence across dividing lines, ones that can actually address some of the kind of core root causes of a conflict and drive peace.
I can imagine that this is hard work. Is that a fair assumption?
It is extremely hard work. We have colleagues who live in the midst of some of the most difficult, violent contexts in the world. When the war in Sudan broke out in Khartoum in April this year, huge number of our team members were forced to flee. Some of them left the country. Others, fled just outside of Khartoum. People lost their homes. We have people who lose family members. So the conditions in which people are working is very difficult. It's also very challenging for people to be willing to cross dividing lines, especially when all the pressures on them are, from their family, from their friends, from their social media networks. All of the forces try to drive people apart, and people don't admire necessarily that. And so people have to hold, and people who do this work, they have to hold an incredibly powerful conviction for the potential to build relationships and transform the societies and build peace. It's incredibly difficult.
And I can imagine when there are setbacks, that must be devastating.
For my experience of this has been that, it takes very little for the work that all of us do in international development to be destroyed. Most of the kinds of changes we're causing, they're changes that take decades to cause. That's true in public health. That's true in economic development. And violent conflict sweeps those aside, and you can sweep them aside in days, literally in days. And setback entire societies. And so, when we see a wave of coups that has happened across West Africa in these past years, the outbreaks of violence that are pretty consistent and nonstop, it's very difficult to sustain and focus and hold our hope.
I bet that there's maybe a slightly different answer for everyone involved in this work, but I wonder for you, what keeps you going?
There's two things, Josh. One is that I actually feel like we don't have a choice. Conflict and dividing conflict, it's like an origin problem of so many of the other critical problems we face in humanity. We actually know that there are solutions. We actually know the solutions to most of the vital challenges we're facing. We know the solutions to climate change. We know the solutions to most of our major public health challenges that we face. We know the solutions to the education. It's our lack of ability to work together, to collaborate, to address inequities that prevent us from actually, pursuing those solutions. And so I kind of am driven by the conviction that if we don't actually figure out how to stop violent conflict, we're going to actually leave ourselves and render ourselves vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable to critical challenges that we're facing as humanity. So that's one, my own personal conviction. The other is that I've seen it work. I see it work. I see people transform. One of the stories I really love to tell is from neighboring Liberia's neighbor, Sierra Leone, which also suffered a very similar and very, very difficult civil war. And when the war ended, Search for Common Ground set up a radio studio there. It's called Talking Drum Studio. It still exists independently, actually, as a media outlet. We wanted to do radio programming that was focused on enabling and equipping all these soldiers who had fought in the war to come home. There was a mass demobilization going on. And so our team there went and found two former military commanders, a guy by the name of Rashad, who had been with the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, and a guy named Fode, who had been part of a pro-government militia in the city of Bo. And they together ran a radio show called Throw Away the Gun. They had fought against each other. And I had dinner with them one night and in Bo. And Rashad turned to me and he said, pointing at Fode, this guy tortured me? And they roared with laughter. And there were a few of us there who looked kind of uncomfortable. And Fode said, Brother Rashad, you invaded my city. What was I supposed to do? What I realized in that moment is that people can change, and people do change. The people who need to build peace are the people who need to build peace. And we need to be willing to engage and create pathways for absolutely everybody who wants to play a role in transforming conflict around them, who look around and say, wow, this polarization that we're seeing is terrifying. I see that it could lead to violence. I want to play a different role, and we need to create pathways for them to do that.
Well, Michael Shipler, this has been a fantastic conversation. You've given me some hope here at the end of 2023. I really appreciate it. Appreciate all the work you and your colleagues do.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.